Hey everyone, welcome back to Watch Your Six. I'm Jason Edwards. Nice to have you. I thought before we get into the topic today, I wanted to sort of revisit the discussions we've had in the last couple of weeks. If you remember some of our previous episodes, we talked about the market, volatility, and how you want to sort of be calm, stay the course, have a good plan. Don't get overreacting to what we see in the news, and don't overreact to the situations that we call talking heads or the information that comes daily. And what happened? Well, what happened was exactly what we said was going to happen. As we see today, the market is back. Had you panicked a month and a half ago and got really concerned and said, oh my goodness, I'm going to sell out of my 401k, I'm going to sell out of all my positions because I don't want to lose anything, well, you would have impacted yourself in a negative way, wouldn't you? You would have locked in those losses, and today you'd be kicking yourself, realizing that you've walked away from incredible returns. If you had left it alone, more than likely you were back to where you were when the market was at its previous highs, or in some cases, maybe 4 or 5% greater. So this really illustrates what we constantly say to our clients. Have a good team. Have someone that you can sound off and share ideas with and concerns with, but in the end, listen to those information, listen to that guidance. The biggest mistake that people make when it comes to investing is letting their emotion dictate their policy. Investing is not an emotional decision. Investing should be analytical, should be logical, it should be methodical, should be focus driven. And if you had done that in the previous adjustment we just had, you would be fine today. You'd have no stress. Your IRA, your 401k back where it was, you'd feel whole again, and the anxiety would have dissipated. But if you get caught up into the things that we had discussed in previous episodes, like market timing, watching the market, trying to pick the best times to buy, the best times to sell, or really trying to silo and look at one position and go, well, I'll wait till it drops up 2% and then I'll sell it. You'll drive yourself literally nuts. And that's something we don't advocate. We want you to make sure that you're successful, but success comes with simple, basic fundamentals: sound policy, sound focus, sound advice, constructive guidance. So again, I thought it was important for us maybe to revisit this discussion, because this is a dynamic that we literally saw unfold in the last couple of months. And for those of our listeners that listened to what we said in our episodes and said, you know what, I'm just going to stay the course, I'm going to follow what we're doing, I'm going to look at my policies and just not get caught up in what's happening this month, they'd be happy today. But for those of you that walked away from maybe good investment strategies, you may have given up 7, 8, 9% in a period of a couple of months. That's huge if you have a 401k or IRA that you're looking to retire with. So again, coming back to some of our fundamentals, do your basic homework. Make sure that you have the right team, and make sure that you're deploying the right resources so that you're not caught up in the latest, what I call latest wave of information, or getting such fads that you think that this is the better way to adjust my portfolio, even though for 20 years it worked a certain way. Have a good team. Have individuals that help you really reflect on watching your six. Now, we're going to talk a little bit today about taxation. It's a topic everyone seems to hate. I know I do. We don't like to pay more taxes than we have to. And more specifically, we're going to get into some strategies that can really help you impact your ability to mitigate your taxes. Now, if you have any assets, whether it's a business, home, or you've had a little bit of wealth, there are really two areas you concern yourself with when it comes to taxes. One is estate tax. That is the taxation of the asset. If and when, God forbid, something were to happen to you, you're going to pass that asset on to your family and members. What kind of taxes will they absorb? Or what kind of taxes will be paid out so that the asset is actually diminished by the amount of reduction in taxes or the reduction of money because you're paying taxes on that asset? That's one issue. The other is income tax. So I work very hard. I still sit there and struggle, build whatever we can build. But every year we get hit with that income tax. Now, if you become successful, if you started to build a business, or you build some large assets, or maybe a real estate portfolio, you're now worried about estate or income taxes. You're worried about what is the way I can mitigate or reduce my income taxes. Well, trusts can accomplish two things, and they can work on both of those fronts. But let's first talk about what a trust is. A trust is just a legal document between two parties. It's a document between a grantor, i.e. the person that owns the asset, and the beneficiary, those individuals that will receive the asset, or the company that will hold the asset. So Many people, we recommend having a proper estate plan. They should include trust work within their estate plan. But what's really unique about trusts is that there are so many different nuances to different dynamics of trust that you can create all kinds of strategies that can help reduce estate tax and or income tax simultaneously. So what do I mean? Well, let's take, for example, estate tax. A lot of times people want to transfer an asset or make sure that asset will be transferred where it reduces the estate tax or the taxes that would be incurred when that asset is passed on. Now, there are such things as what they call an irrevocable trust. That is a gifted trust where you're basically going to take that asset out of your name, and now you're going to put it in a secondary resource where you no longer have access to that trust. Now, since you took it out of your name and it is now owned by another entity, it is no longer part of your estate. So thus, your estate starts to shrink on paper, and now you can pass more of your estate to your beneficiaries while mitigating or reducing your estate taxes. Now, it gets more technical than that, but we're sort of going to give you a 36,000-foot view today on our podcast. There are other resources for what they call an irrevocable ILET. So what does that mean? Well, one thing that people use a lot of to pass on wealth to clients are life insurance, because typically life insurance is non-taxable. You receive it as a tax-free death benefit. But the problem is if you have a very successful estate or a lot of assets, your life insurance can actually be impacted on the estate tax side. So once again, if we use a trust to be the owner or operator of that life insurance policy, we are in essence taking it out of our ownership. The grantor is taking it out of his estate or his pool of wealth. He still has the asset, but now since it's been removed from the estate, he's actually reduced his estate tax. And the estate tax thresholds that the government gives us, they have a tendency now when you do this to fall below those thresholds, which allow you to pass more assets on without incurring some type of estate tax. So that's another nuance to what you can do when it comes to those type of trust movements. Now, there are litanies of estate tax strategies, and I always recommend get with a professional, whether it's your estate planner, whether it's your financial planning team, whether it's your tax counsel. Get with those individuals, sit down, get a very detailed bookkeeping of what you have, a listing of all of your assets, and then talk about what you would like to have in a perfect world. Do you want the assets to be passed on to an entity? Do you want them passed on to your children? Do you want them passed on to a successor or business associate? If you do you want to try to reduce the tax liability now? Do you plan on using some of those assets while you're alive? Is there a way for you to do that so that you can have access to those assets? And there are, while mitigating or minimizing the tax liability associated with the transfer. See, when you have a plan, and remember, this comes back to our strategy with everything, you want to make sure we have a written, concise plan that you can understand, that you can absorb. Never let an individual or group of people that you work with you retain them, you hire them, and they talk over your head and they tell you what's best for you. Only you really know what your goals are. Only you really know how you want things to play out. You may not know technically how to accomplish that, but you know how you want those things to look on paper, so to speak. So when you sit with your financial planning entity or team or group, make sure you just articulate, even in simple terms, here's what I'd like. I'd like these assets to go to my kids. I'd like these assets to go to a nonprofit entity. I'd like this to be something that's sustainable, maybe pays for a foundation so that the ownership of this property I have never goes to anyone else, but it stays in our family and it retains its style. It retains its management style. It looks as if I was still here for the next 20, 30, 50, 60, 100 years. All of those nuances need to be articulated. So now you can plan the proper way and take advantage of the strategies out there. Now let's talk a little about income taxes. There are a lot of really unique and very, very fundamentally sound trust documents or trust accounts that can be established to minimize or reduce income taxes. There are trusts that allow you to basically give the asset away to a beneficiary, but you can live in that asset while you're alive. Therefore, it's not considered part of your estate, and the revenue generated from there's no income. So therefore, there's no tax liability. And if and when that term that you created and that trust is terminated, then it simply goes to your beneficiary. There are trusts that allow you to have the asset housed in a different entity. So the taxes are paid by the trust, but a lower bracket. And why is that critical? Well, most individuals who are high net worth individuals have a lot of assets, and therefore their tax bracket is considered high, if not one of the highest brackets. So a great way to reduce taxation is to try to get a scenario where your income is taxed at a lower bracket. Therefore, you've naturally reduced your taxes. Well, there are trusts that allow you to do that allow you to structure in such a way that the tax liability is paid out at a lower tax bracket. There are trusts that allow you to gift some of those assets that you're receiving income from to, let's say, a beneficiary who might be a minor or a younger person in a much lower bracket, once again reducing tax liability. There are ways for depreciation of an asset to be captured within a trust. So that helps offset the income coming in that wouldn't be available if you had owned the asset yourself or were simply receiving income on a regular basis. But once again, it's really critical that you understand the nuances, you understand the complexity of it, and really understand why you're doing it and how you're doing it. So we always recommend, as I say on this show, make sure you meet with your professionals, whoever they are. At our firm, we do a very complex estate plan with our clients. We sit down with them. We'll bring in estate attorneys. We'll bring in tax counsel, and we'll work as a team because we'll help design the concept of the structure. But you want to make sure you understand it. It does highlight, though, that there is a lot of things we're leaving on the table. If you're not taking your time to put together your team, if you're not taking your time to meet with individuals and make sure you have those individuals in play, you're basically throwing money out the window. And I don't know about you, but I work very hard, and I don't want to sit there and just waste resources. And you're talking about a difference between 10, 15, 20% of overall growth of your estate, whether it's your property, your liquid assets, your business assets. That has a huge impact, especially over time. Imagine losing 10% every year on all the things you put in, efforts into and work into, and the money you build or the wealth you build, and every year you lose 10%. That's a massive degradation of what you've done, right? So again, it's that ripple effect we've talked in previous podcasts. A little scenario, a little adjustment can have a huge impact on your financial strength. And a great way to house assets, a great way to structure your financial abilities is by utilizing trusts and, in some cases, corporations, LLCs. There's all kinds of resources that work together, complement each other, and help you reduce your tax footprint. So, in summation, remember, trust can be utilized a lot of ways. First and foremost, a great way to make sure that somebody's speaking on your behalf if, God forbid, you're no longer here. But it really can be used to help reduce two issues. Estate tax, which ultimately cuts down the size and scope of how big your assets are, and more specifically, how much you are going to transfer to those you love and care about. Or income tax, what you're doing today, how much you're paying to the federal government, and are there ways that you can legally reduce that footprint and take advantage of some of the provisions that exist out there. We strongly recommend that you look into that. Even if you don't have what you consider a large estate, you may be pleasantly surprised that there are ways to dramatically improve your cash flow by reducing your tax liability associated with that. So we hope you like that. If you want more information, obviously contact our firm. Tune in our podcast coming up. We're going to have a lot of information moving forward on different trusts specifically. We'll try to get a little more granular. But we want to give you a brief overview of exactly what we're trying to do and more specifically how those work. So we're going to go to our callers and DMs now. We're going to have some questions from some viewers. So we look forward to having you tune in for that. We'll be right back. So this was an estate question. We have $100,000 sitting in a bank account. And if something were to happen to them, what would be the tax implications or the estate questions that might come up? So this is a great example of poor estate planning if you don't address it while you're alive. So the first issue when you have assets in a bank account is ensuring that the asset gets transferred to whoever you want. Simplest way to do that is put the kids, if they're not minors, put them on your checking account. You want to have multiple names on that checking account. Otherwise, what could happen is if, God forbid, something were to happen to you, you died, and that account's in your name, or let's just say you're in your wife's name, it now goes into probate, which means that children or the beneficiaries would actually have to go to court To prove they were entitled to that, they'd have to spend anywhere from 10 to 15% of the asset using an attorney to get a ruling, and then the judge would order those funds to be released. Simplest way is if you added a beneficiary to your checking account, so you're both on the checking account, if something were to happen to you, they can then go into the bank, write them a check, take the money out, and it's theirs. So it's a great way to circumvent what we call probate issues. Now, tax implications, it depends on how that account is titled. And again, we don't want to give tax advice on the podcast because we don't know. But in some cases, the asset could be passed on to the kids tax-free. In some cases, the asset would be passed on to them as a fully taxable event. So that's where you really want to make sure you understand how that account's titled, who the owner of the account is, how the beneficiaries are set up. Is it post-tax or pre-tax money? So I hope that helped you, gave you a little guidance. But again, there's more information you're going to want to know when it comes to specifics. So we have a really good question on basically transfer of a property. So in this case, we've got an individual who's got property. Parents are getting older. They're trying to determine what's the best way to transfer the house. Do they transfer it to the child now? Wait till they're deceased? Do they sell on the property? Now, here's the problem with real estate transfer, and here's some of the challenges. First of all, you have two parts. One, again, is the probate part. Who owns the property? That's an issue you want to address ahead of time. You don't want to wait till the last minute. But the second is what they call the cost basis, meaning what did you pay for the house and what it's worth. And the taxes are where you run into the big difference. So we always recommend, first and foremost, when it comes to the estate part, that you may want to quick deed. Again, it depends on your dynamic. You may want to quick deed and have that house where now your child owns it along with you. So if something were to happen to you, they can just take over ownership of the house. That's the estate question or the probate question. Now, a great way, though, to mitigate tax liability is to inherit the house at their death. Why do I say that? Well, what happens when you inherit a property at their death, you now inherit it at the current market value. That means that house, let's say they bought it for $10,000, and now when they died, the house was worth $1 million. Well, that spread is what you might have to pay taxes on, meaning that if they sold it today as their primary residence, they might have a capital gain. But if you inherited it at their death, you're inheriting it when it's worth $1 million. That means your cost basis is $1 million, and you sold it for $1 million, which means your profit is what? Zero. So again, not knowing all the nuances, we're not telling you to do one way or the other. Those are the two different ways you can look at property transfer. I still strongly recommend that you sit down with a professional, give them more information, because there's questions I would ask before I told you which way to go. But those are the two considerations that you want to look at. Hopefully that gave you some guidance and helped you out with that. We had a really good question regarding inheritance and gifting. And the question was, the parents were basically lower bracket income, so the assets may not be as large as we think. And so they have some assets that they want to maybe give to their children. So they're wondering, should I gift it now, or should I worry about maybe just leaving it and getting it to where they inherit it later? Now, here's the big differential with gifting versus inheritance. There's obviously tax implications, but I'll tell you the one thing you want to remember is a gift you give to an individual, they don't have to spend that money. So you can give it to them and they can hold on an asset forever. However, if an individual inherits funds, let's say, for example, inherits an IRA, the federal government requires that money to be spent within a certain window. So now there is no choice. As a beneficiary, I inherited funds from a family member. I've got to spend it. I can't keep it for 20 years. I can't wait to pass it on. So take the tax implications off the board. If you're just looking at gift versus inheritance, if you're gifting it to the beneficiary, they have the legal authority to do whatever they want now. They can hold on the asset. They can spend it. When you leave it to an inheritance strategy and they inherit it at your death, there is the possibility, and again I say possibility, that those assets would have to be spent prematurely. So you want to think about that first, because if taxes aren't the consideration, then it has to do with how you want those assets spent and how long you want them to last. So hopefully that helped you as well. But again, those are great questions. I always recommend, and I keep coming back to it, sit down with your financial planning team or professionals. Make sure you get something that is indicative to your particular strategy. Sound good? And I think we have one more question. So this is a question I actually run into a lot with estates. So I've got assets, clients have a lot of assets, but they also have a lot of debt. So the beneficiaries are concerned, well, what do I do with the debt? Well, here's the ugly unknown fact that most people, particularly credit card companies, are not going to want to tell you. Unless you're on the agreements, unless you're on the debt-related agreements, you sign those as joint agreement or consumer agreement, that debt's not your problem. I hate to say it, they don't want you to know that. But if they've got $100 million in credit cards and it's under their name and God forbid they die, the only challenge is the estate might be liable for that. But if those assets had already been moved out of the estate and they're no longer in their name, for example, I mentioned earlier in one of our podcasts, an irrevocable, where they gifted it to another entity and the estate has nothing, well, the debt is their problem and the debt goes when they go. So I wouldn't be overly concerned with the debt. I would sit down and make sure that you understand how the estate is structured and if the assets are in that estate, because theoretically the debtors could put a lien on those assets, but you want to make sure you know how things are titled. If you title things properly, you could mitigate some of that. The biggest concern when you're a beneficiary that you're really going to be more overwhelmed with, or maybe something that you're going to give more insight to, would be how do those assets transfer easily? Do they transfer easily? What's the tax obligations? I wouldn't necessarily worry about the debt, but again, I would worry about the impact to the estate if the estate was still tied to that debt. And if their names were the same, then there's a possibility that some debtors could put a lien. But people love to get you scared. I mean, I dealt with a scenario where, my grandmother was very ill, not doing well. She had nothing, no assets whatsoever. And we're getting nasty grams from the credit card company going, well, if you don't pay this, we'll mess up her FICO score. She was 97. So what does she care about a FICO score? She's not buying a house. She's not buying a car. So there was nothing they could do at that point. So I'm not advocating for you to default debt. I'm just highlighting that there is a nuance there. And if the assets are protected properly, the debt is probably at least of your concerns. So hope all those questions went well for you. I hope we always appreciate tuners coming in and letting us know some of their questions. And we look forward to those tuning in more next week. Always feel free to email us or DM us through our IG, Instagram page. We'd love to have more questions on air. It's something we thrive on, and we look forward to having you here next week. Thank you once again for tuning in to Watch Your Six. We look forward to having you on our episodes, and we'll have some interviews, really exciting interviews coming up soon. And as always, watch your six, have a great night, and talk to you later.